The surrender of Nazi Germany in May 1945 marked the collapse of a once-feared military force, but the remnants of its massive war machine persisted in the aftermath, seemingly at odds with the newfound peace. Among these remnants was the formidable fleet of German U-boats, which had wreaked havoc on Allied shipping for years, helping to cripple supply lines and deepen the war's global scale. Yet, in the wake of the war's conclusion, these deadly submarines, once symbols of German naval supremacy, found themselves obsolete, unwanted, and surrounded by uncertainty. With the signing of the unconditional surrender, it was as if a curtain had fallen. The U-boats, many of them new and advanced, had fulfilled their grim purpose. But what happened to them? What became of the hundreds of vessels that had so recently been instruments of terror in the Atlantic, now lying dormant in harbors, their steel shells tarnished, their engines silent? In 1945, the staggering scale of Germany's U-boat fleet posed a dilemma for both the Allies and the defeated nation. The numbers were staggering. By the end of the war, Germany had produced more than 1,100 submarines, each a technological marvel, designed to strike fear into the hearts of Allied naval commanders. Yet, with the war over, the U-boat had lost its place in the New World Order. The German Navy, which had once commanded respect, was no more, and the U-boat fleet, for all its lethal promise, was a symbol of the past, its power gone, its purpose obsolete. As the war officially ended in May 1945, the priorities of the Allies shifted from combat to the dismantling of the German war apparatus. The very presence of so many U-boats in German harbors was an immediate problem. The need for demilitarization was pressing, and the U-boats, which had once been hailed as strategic weapons, were now seen as little more than scrap metal, potential threats, or inconvenient relics of a bygone war. The immediate response was a combination of destruction, repurposing, and abandonment. The Allies were focused on the massive task of disarming and neutralizing the German military in a manner that would prevent any future resurgence. The U-boats, still largely intact, posed logistical challenges. Some were scuttled by their German crews in a last act of defiance, while others were taken by the Allies for assessment, study, or repurposing. The fate of each submarine varied wildly depending on location, strategic value, and the whims of the forces in charge. In the immediate aftermath of the war, U-boats that were found in German ports were often towed to designated graveyards for interment. These graveyards, usually situated in the shallow waters near naval bases, became the resting places for many of the U-boats that had survived the war. Here, the submarines were stripped of their valuable materials, copper, steel, electronics, before they were either sunk or left to slowly decay beneath the surface. In the process, they became part of a larger story of wartime waste and resourcefulness. The scale of the operation was immense, and yet, despite the vast number of U-boats involved, the salvage operation barely made a dent in the overall number. It was estimated that only a small fraction of the total U-boat fleet was effectively scrapped or repurposed in the early years after the war. Not all U-boats met their end in such a straightforward manner. Some were claimed by the Allies as spoils of war. A portion of the fleet, particularly the more advanced models, was taken to ports in the United Kingdom, the United States, and the Soviet Union. Here, they were studied, dissected, and reverse-engineered as part of broader efforts to understand and adapt German technology for the post-war era. The Americans, in particular, took a keen interest in the Type XXI U-boat, which had set new standards for speed and underwater endurance. These efforts were part of the broader Cold War arms race, where knowledge of German technology was seen as a valuable asset, even if the vessels themselves were far too cumbersome to serve any active military purpose. The British, too, took a particular interest in the German U-boats. In their case, the interest was less about direct military application and more about understanding the secrets of their stealth and technology. The British Royal Navy sought to replicate the innovations found within the German U-boat designs, such as the advanced sonar systems and the highly efficient diesels. Some U-boats were even used as training vessels for Allied submariners, offering a hands-on learning experience that was otherwise unavailable. Yet, as the years passed, the vast majority of the remaining U-boats were left to decay. The harsh realities of post-war Europe meant that resources were strained, and the sheer scale of the task of dealing with the remnants of war often led to corners being cut. With the economic pressures of rebuilding nations, prioritizing the reuse of materials like steel and copper, and the gradual decline in the strategic importance of submarines, many of the remaining U-boats were abandoned to the elements. Decommissioned boats were often left tied to piers, rusting away in the saltwater of harbors like Kiel, Wilhelmshaven, and Flensburg. Their once proud forms, now corroded and hollow, became silent monuments to a war that had ended but whose consequences still rippled through the world. As late as the early 1950s, U-boats continued to be a part of the European landscape, scattered in various locations, some still half-submerged in shallow harbors. Yet, despite these enduring reminders of their destructive power, the global focus had moved elsewhere. The Cold War began to reshape the geopolitical landscape, and the technological marvels of the U-boat were slowly eclipsed by the rise of nuclear-powered submarines and missile-equipped fleets. For many of the U-boats, this marked the final chapter. The remaining vessels, too costly to be effectively scrapped, too outdated for repurposing, were simply abandoned. As the years passed, they were overtaken by the sea or dismantled in quiet, unceremonious operations. They were swept into the vast ocean of history, barely remembered, lost to time. In this world of post-war uncertainty and recovery, there seemed to be no place for these symbols of a now-defunct military order. The U-boats, once the pride of Nazi Germany's Kriegsmarine, had been rendered obsolete by the shifting tides of technological and geopolitical change. The factories that had built them lay in ruins, their workers scattered or displaced, the industrial capabilities redirected to more immediate post-war needs. These once feared machines of war, now little more than forgotten shells, illustrated a stark, unspoken truth of war's aftermath. Victory had not just displaced an enemy, but left behind a mass of material waste, the traces of which lingered for years after the guns fell silent. After the war ended, the fate of the German U-boat fleet was far from simple. By the summer of 1945, the fleets of Allied forces were already deep into their occupation of Germany, and the U-boats, most of which had been docked in harbors across the country, began to come under Allied control. The Allies had inherited the problem of a war machine that was far from fully dismantled, and the U-boat fleet was a haunting reminder of the war's destructive power. With the war over, the situation now required swift action, but the solutions were anything but straightforward. The initial task was to assess the U-boat fleet and determine its strategic value. While many were quickly deemed obsolete, others, particularly the newer models like the Type XXI, were still considered technologically advanced. The U-boats had been the subject of considerable development throughout the war, and many were built with cutting-edge technologies such as improved sonar, better propulsion systems, and longer-range capabilities. These innovations were not lost on the Allies, who immediately sought to understand and incorporate these technologies into their own naval forces. It was a matter of military pragmatism. Whoever could harness these innovations would gain a significant advantage in the next phase of the Cold War. But for all the technological advancements, the practicalities of dealing with the massive fleet proved overwhelming. The U-boat fleet, by the end of the war, had dwindled in numbers, but it was still large. Approximately 200 submarines had survived the conflict, and the remaining fleet needed to be dealt with. A number of measures were taken, but the process was not as swift or simple as one might think. The first action taken by the Allies was to begin sinking U-boats in a large-scale operation known as Operation Deadlight. This was an attempt to rid Europe of the dangerous remnants of Nazi power by scuttling the U-boats in the cold waters off the coast of Northern Ireland. Between 1945 and 1946, over 120 U-boats were deliberately sunk as part of this operation, most of them Type 7 and Type 9 models. It was an unsettling act of finality, and for many U-boats, this was the end. Some of these vessels were scuttled with explosives, while others were simply allowed to sink under their own weight. The fate of the U-boats, however, was not always so definitive. Many were not sunk immediately. Some were handed over to various Allied nations for further evaluation. The British, for example, were particularly interested in the Type XXI U-boats, which had been developed late in the war and boasted the ability to travel at greater depths and greater speeds than most submarines of the era. British Admiralty officials believed that by reverse engineering the U-boats, they could gain a competitive edge over the Soviet Union in the years to come. The British military took a number of these U-boats for their own use, but not for active combat. Instead, they used them as training tools, allowing Allied submariners to understand German submarine technology up close. In the United States, too, there was interest in the U-boats. The Americans, fresh off the defeat of the Axis powers, were engaged in their own arms race with the Soviet Union. They took a particular interest in the technological advancements of the U-boats, as they believed that studying them could help them further develop their own submarine fleet. Many U-boats were transported to American ports for deconstruction and analysis, with the goal of acquiring German innovations such as sonar and hull design. In some cases, the U-boats were even tested in American waters, although the decision was soon made that these submarines, for all their advancements, were not suitable for active duty in the post-war Navy. Despite the initial efforts to reverse engineer or reassign the U-boats for further use, it quickly became clear that most of the remaining fleet was no longer viable for military use. The logistics of maintaining such a large fleet of submarines were not practical in the post-war environment. The Allies, focused on rebuilding their economies and military capabilities for a new global conflict, simply had no use for them. The scarcity of resources, combined with the ongoing challenges of demilitarization, meant that the fate of many U-boats would be determined by economic necessity. As the early post-war years unfolded, the U-boats that remained in German harbors began to deteriorate. Left untended in the saltwater, their once pristine steel hulls began to rust. In some cases, entire fleets of submarines were abandoned to the elements, either because they were too costly to maintain or because the Allies had no use for them. By 1947, the remaining U-boats were scattered in various locations around Germany, slowly succumbing to corrosion. As the war shifted further into memory and the Cold War loomed large, there was little public or military will to preserve these vessels. The cold, silent submarines, remnants of a previous age, became almost invisible, blending into the post-war landscape of recovery. In addition to the slow deterioration of abandoned U-boats, some vessels met a different fate. Various U-boats were sold off as scrap metal, a decision driven by the severe material shortages that affected much of Europe in the immediate post-war years. The economies of European nations, particularly in the wreckage of Germany, required a large influx of raw materials to rebuild industries and infrastructure. The steel from the U-boats, along with other components, was sold to scrap merchants. The ships were stripped of their valuable parts, including engines, radar, and electrical systems, before being melted down and repurposed for civilian use. The decision to scrap these vessels was seen as a pragmatic move, reflecting the dire economic circumstances of the time. In some cases, the scrapping process was slow, as the dismantling of these large submarines was no small task. The U-boats were large and cumbersome, requiring significant effort to disassemble. Yet, the necessity of converting military resources into civilian goods overrode the lingering military potential of the submarines. Some of the U-boats, particularly the Type XXI models, were even used as test cases in the early years of the Cold War to evaluate new technologies for underwater operations, but this was more a matter of exploiting a resource rather than repurposing the fleet for active duty. By the early 1950s, the dismantling process was largely complete. Those remaining U-boats that had not been destroyed in Operation Deadlight or sold off for scrap were left to rot in quiet harbors, forgotten and decaying. The U-boat fleet, once a terror of the Atlantic, had been absorbed into the industrial landscape of post-war Europe, stripped of its military relevance and disbanded piece by piece. There was little public outcry or debate over the fate of these machines of war, as the priorities of the world had shifted from the remnants of past battles to the emerging tensions of the Cold War. As time passed, the memory of the U-boat fleet began to fade from collective consciousness. The submarines, now little more than a footnote in the larger story of World War II, drifted into history. The lessons learned from their construction and use would not be forgotten, but their once feared reputation was no longer relevant in the new geopolitical world of the 1950s. For all the technological sophistication of the German U-boat fleet, it had been a symbol of a defeated power, and like the rest of Nazi Germany's war machine, it was slowly relegated to history's distant past. The U-boat fleet's post-war fate, from rapid scuttling to slow decay, highlighted a larger truth about the aftermath of World War II. The world had no interest in prolonging the legacy of war. The machinery of death, once so carefully designed and painstakingly constructed, had become redundant, discarded, and forgotten. The U-boats had lived their life in the brutal theater of war, but their legacy was destined to fade away quietly as time and the demands of post-war reconstruction eroded the remnants of Nazi Germany's military ambitions. This quiet ending, the disbanding and dismantling of an entire fleet that had once ruled the seas, reflected the broader challenges of rebuilding a war-torn world. The U-boats, like many other remnants of the war, found themselves discarded, caught between the immense technological innovations of their time and the evolving priorities of a new era.